Hello, Doubts Aloud listeners. And for the second episode this year, we're picking up again from the episode we did last year before the Palestine one, which was presuppositional apologetics. And we did a broad outline of that. And so before we continue with that, we're just going to refresh your minds. And in case some of you may have just come onto this podcast first before that, we're just going to sort of refresh our own minds, really, because this is a subject that's actually quite complicated when it gets down to the details. But to give it a simple approach to what we're going to be talking about and what we did talk about, we're just going to start with refreshing on that. So, presuppositional apologetics. So, Ed and Francis, do you want to sort of kick off on refreshing what we did last time?
Yep. First to say, congratulations, you're actually listening to us, having seen the title of the episode, particularly if you've suffered the first stab of it. The basic idea, Andrew summarized in a completely unhelpful way. He said, God's word says you are wrong, so you have no case to make. But Francis, what was your summary of the approach of presuppositional apologetics?
Gosh, I wish I'd had notice of that because I can't, off the top of my head, remember it. What was it? What was my summary? That
the only proof of the Christian position is that unless its truth is presupposed, there is no possibility of proving anything at all.
Yeah, that is what I said. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. And we can prove this by looking at the text that I've got in front of me where you wrote it down. Yeah. So,
yes, that's right. Both of those I gave quotes that you'd each individually found to sum up the whole thing. So none of them are actually your.
That's right.
Words.
So just to go back to anybody that doesn't know anything about presuppositional apologetics, and apologetics is a way of defending and arguing for, say, in Christianity anyway, the Christian faith. So you would have people would make certain arguments to show the unbeliever out there why Christianity is true in their view. And one of them is a stranger one because it's called presuppositional apologetics. And so as Francis just outlined there in the one I did, in its simplest form, it takes a very, very different angle to what you might expect, because somebody out there might say, well, how is Christianity true? And somebody might say, well, I've had this experience, I was healed or something. Or if you look at the archaeology of Israel, it shows you that this aspect of the Bible is true. And if you go to look at the aspects of the world, we think it points to a God, and you're arguing for evidence. Okay, so that's the sort of classical or a simplistic way of putting the classical way of arguing for the Christian faith. It's with evidence that you can see in the world, and people would have to go, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. Good evidence there. So I like that. And you mount it all up, and then you come to a conclusion and say, well, it looks like there's a good case for Christianity. Presuppositional apologetics takes the completely opposite angle to that. It actually says before you can do any discussions, you just have to simply presuppose, in one sense it sounds silly, but you have to presuppose that Christianity and God and the Bible are true. And once you have that foundation, you can then have your reasoning capacities, you can have your ability to tell people certainly what's true. And so it does sound a little bit, I don't know, arrogant, I suppose, to somebody hearing that, to say, well, Jesus is real, the Bible's true, and therefore you've got no other argument to make. And so that's where the simplistic way of putting the presuppositional idea of apologetics in a form of language. So I hope, does that make sense to both of you? If someone was starting from scratch on this?
I think so. Yeah. Yes, I think you've set it out quite clearly. Yeah. It is that view that before you can make any progress at all, you have to start with a basis, and that basis has to be the existence of God, and specifically the Christian God.
Yes, and then the argument might say, somebody might say, well, why does that could apply to deism, and then we have to have another argument. But they actually go further and say it's the triune Christian God of the Bible. The Bible's seen in a certain way, it's inerrant, no mistakes, it's just simply almost like a monolithic view. And it gets complicated because if you ever came across a presuppositionalist, you would have thought that the alternates are simply that understanding of that Christian and your non-Christian understanding of things, when it's actually so much more complicated, because as we discussed in the last episode, other Christians thoroughly disagree with this form of apologetics, and they say no, it's the classical evidential way we need to go. And they argue the Bible would support evidential stuff much more than this assumptions of things. And it's obvious things like the narratives, the characters of the Bible, and the disciples didn't walk around speaking like these people do. And so, because this is much more in the philosophical garbed language to try and make a case for Christianity. And so I would just say to us, before we move on, those are the ideas to actually think about. And so, but what I have noticed is that non-Christians and even other Christians who meet a presuppositionalist Christian can be very much stumped by and caught off guard and completely thrown off by their way that they word things, because they make you sound that you don't even have an argument to stand on. You don't have rationality. You don't have a case unless you acknowledge that God is real and Christianity is real. You don't have a case to make even a mathematical equation, because it all comes from that founding of Christianity. That's the presupposition. So there we go. So that's, I think,
yes,
the way I'd put it.
Yeah.
Okay. So
from
there.
Well, I think from there I think you're quite keen, Andrew, for us to summarize a couple of points.
Yes.
One is the connection with Reformed theology, which is this Calvinism.
Yes, that's right.
And the other is the massive overlap with young earth creationism.
Yeah, I noticed, and again, I mentioned this in the previous one with a bit more detail. You can go back to 2 episodes ago. But I noticed when I first understood and picked up on this idea of presuppositional apologetics, I sort of always look at all subjects in the way that I'm wired. I don't just sort of deal with the subject. I seem to be aware in my thinking, the way I'm wired is, and what's this related to? What could it be linked to? And I noticed straight away that many of them were young earth creationists straight away. I also noticed that all of them are Reformed theologians, which means that they are on the sort of Calvinist side of things in these aspects, compared with, say, Arminian and the more free will, the way that Arminians talk about free will. And so if you were to meet, say, an open theist Christian, you would be miles away probably from having them speak like a presuppositionalist. So I picked up that very, very early on. If you're a Calvinistic Christian, you're much more likely, matter of fact, almost solely going to get a presuppositional apologetic. Although there are Catholic presuppositional apologetics, and so that sort of throws a little spanner in the work, and they have a slightly different foundation, because the Bible is actually a different version with different books or added books than the Protestant one. And so that really throws a spanner in the foundation of the Bible for those. So when I found these cracks straight away, I had a problem. And I remember hearing one of them, Cy Ten Bruggen, he was on the Unbelievable Christian show. He was debating somebody about this. And he said straight away, before I even knew, this was before I knew much about it, and he had straight away, he said, right, if you don't believe in basically the Reformed principles of total depravity of man and original sin in Adam, then presuppositionalism, this is more or less a quote, is shot through to pieces. And I went, oh, so that's shot through to pieces then, and then felt like turning it off because I was only a Calvinist for a short time, and I'd seen that my experience of Christianity led me to non-Calvinistic ideas of the faith. And so straight away I thought, oh, well, that's large sections can just dismiss this straight away, because unless they're going to become a Calvinist, you're very unlikely to take the presuppositional apologetic line. And so they were the links that I discovered.
Yeah.
Then people like Ken Ham and other people, and Greg Bunson, who was the famous person that took it over from Van Til, which, if we go back to the episode, Francis talked about Cornelius Van Til as like the father of this view, or at least the father of the articulation of these details. Greg Bunson was railing against evolution and the evidence for evolution, and all in a talk to do with presuppositional apologetics. And I thought, why is that? And it's all to do with how you understand the Bible as an inerrant, revealed word of God. And it just seems to be the young earth naturalistic reading of the text trumps science as we currently understand it. So I thought straight away then, so if you're a theistic evolution, you're not going to go this way. of a presuppositional apologetics. People like Peter Enns and everything, they won't go anywhere near this kind of idea, it seems to me, from my observations. So I took all those observations in and then began to build a case of the cracks for it, because it's very hard to debate a person because they get you tongue twisted in language before you know it.
Yeah.
So I tend to be thinking of these alternate angles to look at the whole thing rather than just take the argument head on, which is where Ed or Francis, you might take the argument head on.
Well, we're going to do that in a
yes,
bit.
That's right.
Actually, what you said has prompted me to mention something Josh Preek, who's now official friend of the show,
Yes.
has pointed out to us. And that is, the presuppositionists are getting this truth from the Bible, and they have to sort of do it without interpretation and without scholarship. And that would be why, if on the face of it, the Bible says God made the world a few thousand years ago in 6 days, then that's what happened. And you can't apply scholarship and intuition to it, because then you're drifting into this evidentialistic approach, which Andrew's shown us is impossible to sit with presuppositional apologetics.
Yes, and in fact, absolutely rejected by presuppositionalists. They think that you are then putting your corrupted human reasoning before God, and God comes first, and then you accept that your reasoning is only available to you insofar as it comes from God.
Yeah,
they would
which
say
is weird, because of Reformed theology is not obviously the message of the Bible.
No,
yeah,
that's also true.
They would say, I think that, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, that you could get probably quite an ignorant presuppositionalist who knows nothing really about the Bible in terms of other than what they've been taught in their Reformed denomination, and would just almost be taught that looking at the scriptures in a sort of an academic, critical scholarship way is an almost apostasy approach anyway. And so it's really ironic, isn't it, and yet the irony of that is that even the translations that we have, we're trusting people, human beings who have made translations, you know what I mean, who are Hebrew grammatists or grammarians, I think the word is, who do their best, as far as we know, to try and get the right reading of a text, and then the variants are still there. And these people are human people using academic evidences to say, well, which was the Hebrew? But, you know, that none of them are getting a direct revelation from God, as far as we know, on how to translate. And so then the Reformed person just simply takes this English version, presumably, and holds it up and say, this can then swamp every scholar out there because we understand it this way. I mean, it does seem to get everything backwards. I would say, certainly from hearing some of the apologetics, they're not scholars, the presuppositionists. They're literally like, they've got day jobs. Cy ten Bruggen is an engineer, you know what I mean? Sort of like a machine engineer of some sort, he said, you know, and other people. And so he's just picked up on Greg Banson, studied him to death, and then goes around doing his thing, telling everyone else that this is the only way to understand Christianity and to demonstrate Christianity. And so it's like when you get someone like Peter Enns, they'd just be looking at someone like that thinking, you know nothing. You know what I mean? You know nothing from just, you know, the human. And I think, Francis, didn't we talk about, didn't presupposition allow human beings to actually have some knowledge and skills and ability?
Yes, it was very, you know, they couldn't quite make their minds up. And the question is, has Van Til managed to square that circle? Because on the one hand, he wants to say, oh, well, yes, you know, I'm not saying that you can't have any knowledge. And yet in other places, he's saying, well, you can't have any knowledge, you know. So he wants to both say that, oh, yes, of course, you know, somebody who's a scholar or somebody who's a physicist, they can have knowledge. But at the same time, he's saying, well, nobody's got any knowledge because all human knowledge is corrupt. So, I mean, he never really manages to settle that issue.
Because when he was railing against evolution, he'd be saying all these great experts in biology just don't know what they're talking about. You know, so
Yes.
And because the word of God says this, and so it trumps. Obviously, this is all man's made up nonsense. And so, to me, I find the whole thing, as you get into this rabbit warren, it's an alien place for the human being to inhabit, really.
Yeah.
So
what we're going to do now then, jumping in to move things on, is to actually look at the basic argument rather than the kind of culture and approach.
Yeah.
And it's called the transcendental argument for God. And I think Francis has really done some good work on what transcendental arguments are in general. And so I think over to you, Francis.
Okay, well, in fairness, the work I did was to find some work that somebody else did. So I'm really quoting somebody else. And the place I took it from was Debunking Christianity on the Failure of the Van Tillian Argument. And they say, well, it's helpful to look at an example of a transcendental argument in action. And the example they give is actually, again, something that somebody else has did. They took it from Julian Baggini, and he gives us this example that John Searle, who's a philosopher, has offered what he views as a transcendental argument for external realism, the view that there is a real world that exists independently of our experiences. And he says that a transcendental argument is that it works by taking something as its given fact that in ordinary discourse is meaningful. So, for example, if we agree to meet at a certain place at a certain time, that is meaningful only because external realism is true. So what they're getting at is, in order to have this meaningful discussion, what would have to be true to make it meaningful? And in the terms of the presuppositionalism and the transcendental argument for God, it's in order for us to have a discussion, what do we need to assume to make that possible as what do we have to presume before we can even start to have that argument? I mean, I can put the or you can put it in the show notes. Put the link in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, great.
Yeah. It's interesting because in my preparation for this, I've come across some objections to the transcendental, the presups transcendental argument. Can we call it TAG? TAG, transcendental argument. God,
TAG.
Okay, otherwise I get tongue-tied with it. One of the pushbacks against TAG would actually take this down as well. But even Julian, who I think is great, Julian Baggini, he seems to be okay with it. He said they are very much alive in terms of general transcendental arguments, and still a useful part of the repertoire of argumentative techniques. That's what he says. But the takedown was that basically that this is only establishing what we want to be the case. It's only a meaningful discourse to agree to meet in a certain time and place if external realism is true. But maybe it is just a useful fiction. Maybe we are just brains in vats and we agree to meet, and we do. Apparently, the vat master ensures that we do meet at the time unless other events prevent us in our minds. So it's still what we want to be true is established, not what is true.
Yes, I thought that was that was perhaps the pushback on that take on the transcendental argument, that it's only a problem with the meaningfulness of that discussion if you could somehow step outside the whole realm and judge it by a kind of parallel universe look at our universe and say, oh, well, they all think this, but it's not really true. So we get on perfectly well by using the assumption that these things are meaningful and that they do relate to a real state of the world. But if there existed some parallel universe where they could look in on our universe and judge whether it was in fact meaningful, it doesn't mean that because we all get on using that and it's all fine and it works for us, doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually true. I mean, that's how I would see it.
Yeah. So we're agreeing then.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
do I normally disagree with you then? No, I'm agreeing with you. I came in to agree with you.
Well, you gave us material from Julian Baggini, who we both respect, and we're disagreeing with him.
Yes, that's correct. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Or I'm at least I'm questioning him. I don't know. You know, I'm not convinced. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the general, and then so how does that become tag?
So on tag, let me
tag, just refreshing, meaning the transcendental argument
for God, for the existence of God.
Yeah. So I've got a version of it here, if you want.
Yes, probably you're the best person to set it out because you've already written the notes on it.
Yeah. So what I've seemed to come across is that it's a structure of an argument, and you can slot in a logic or morality or meaning or reason or the ability or rationality, those kind of concepts. They overlap a lot, but people can pick one and then plug it in and see how it goes down through the argument. So the first step is to say God is a necessary precondition for logic or rationality or morality. And these are considered immaterial and yet real. So these are not material things like the universe, but a real kind of universal like logic or rationality. So that's one. Two, people depend on the logic, morality, whatever it's going to be, and show that they depend on them, on these universals, and that they couldn't exist in a materialistic universe. But so that presupposes, and they presuppose as they go about their lives, the existence of the immaterial and absolute God who so that's linking back to one. So God's a necessary precondition of, let's just keep it simple. God's a necessary precondition of logic. People depend on logic as they go about their lives. And so they're kind of making it clear that they think it's a real thing. And therefore they presuppose in God, and therefore God exists. And then carrying on, if he didn't, we could not rely on logic and other absolute universals, and could not exist in a materialist universe where there are no absolute standards or an absolute lawgiver. The lawgiver relates to morality. So that's what the argument is. Are you happy with that, Sir Francis? And
I am. Yes.
Yep.
Yes. I think you've set that out very clearly.
Yeah. So one of the key steps which I picked up is that there's a distinction between having a debate with a presuppositionalist where they insist that you have to be able to talk about morality in a secure way, or talk about logic in a secure way, before you can then use it in the debate. So that's like establishing that logic is true and real and can be relied upon. Then I'm calling that kind of category A. And then category B is the requirement that the presuppositionalist will put on us to explain at the most basic level how logic works, say, or how the presuppositions of science are truly grounded. So option A is a kind of a epistemology in terms of how you establish that it's true. And option B, I think people call ontology, which is the kind of comprehensive grounding of whatever it is we're talking about, why logic works, to explain it in its real true sense, rather than just, okay, we can establish that it works, but we don't understand why. So those are the A and B, the kind of being able to come to the table with an argument, having established that what the tools that you've got work and are reliable. And option B is saying that, more from the presupposition, saying, look, if you can't explain these tools you're using, then go away. And those are different things.
I suppose what I'd say, which I don't know, you might consider to be not quite on the point you're making, is that you can't measure a thing against itself. So you can't say that we ought to be moral in the sense that using a moral ought, because morality is the measure by which we judge what we ought to do in that sense. And you can't measure geometry. You use geometry to measure other things. So I suppose that is on A, that we always adopt the approach of A, rather than trying to say, well, if we can't measure geometry, then geometry doesn't exist and it's no use to us and we should reject it. You do have to start from the idea that you have a standard, and it's just what you use that standard, but you can't apply the standard to the standard itself, if you like. You can't measure the measure.
Yeah.
So what would be a better example of just trying to explain that? Or an example of explaining that, like an actual example.
Well, I suppose, I think you quite often in debates on morality get people to say, well, why should I be good? Well, because why ought I to be good? Because that's what ought means in that context. And in terms of, do we need to account for logic? No, I don't see that we do. I mean, we know that we can use logic, and that's all we need to know. We don't have to ground it in something else.
Right. Okay. So it's practical.
Yeah.
And it works.
Yeah. What I want to do is use that to give an example of what's happening in a debate between a full-on pre-supper and a unprepared atheist debate partner. So, but imagine instead of that, it's a maths lesson, and somebody in the maths lesson says, look, I want to show you using geometry that the value of pi is whatever, or whatever they do. And then someone else says, no, you're not allowed to do that unless you first ground why geometry is fully rational and established. And the person says, well, I can't. We just accept the geometry. And then the unhelpful person says, well, I'm a Christian and I understand that geometry is founded on God and he's willed it, and that's why it's so secure. So I can say what I like about geometry and you have to shut up.
Right. That's how it's put.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good example.
Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to say. And I think there's a slight bit of double standards here, in that we both can say logic is reliable and true, and we can give, maybe the atheist can give some reasons for why they think it's true, but we can't say what in a kind of metaphysical way that it's founded. It's just something that we see is there. We can come on more to that, but the point I'm trying to make at this stage is that there's two things going on, and the pre-supper in a debate might be swapping between one and the other in a subtle way to...
So you think there's kind of bait and switch going on?
Yes, that's right. And another thing that I'd like to pick up on before we go too much further is the difference between an abductive argument and a deductive argument. And if this is going to be a deductive argument, I don't see how they can get off the ground, because they've got to establish as absolutely definitely true premises things like that God is the only possible way that you could ground logic. And I don't know how you could just go about that.
There does seem to be something of them sawing off the branch they're sitting on, because they appear to be trying to use a logical argument to show that logical arguments don't work unless you believe in God, unless you accept the existence of God.
Yes, that's exactly what they're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I heard somebody go further than that and said that you cannot do maths unless I actually put it in these terms, well, unless Jesus is real.
You said that last time. Yeah.
I think that was Eric Hovind. And I thought, wow. And he said, I know it sounds crazy, but let me explain. And then he went on to explain. And it's something to do with exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So what carry on, Francis.
Sorry, I was going to say that also on the Debunking Christianity site, which I think is quite helpful in explaining presuppositionalism and what's wrong with it, and the challenge to tag, that you have to, according to Van Til and those who follow him, you can't even be just a deist and believe this. You have got to take the whole Christian deal. And part of the article, if anybody wants to go and look at it, it's at paragraph 7.3 on, deals with a suggestion that there could be a belief called Christianity, and that the person who is a believer in Christianity says that instead of a trinity, we have a quadrinity in Christianity. Instead of the 66 books of the Bible, we could have 65 with mirrored yet different stories of genealogies, poetry, all have their unique Christian flavour. Christian apologists then argue transcendentally that you must presuppose Christianity in order for our experience to be intelligible. So when a Christian and a Christian argue, the Christian has to assume the truth of Christianity even to begin to argue against it, because Christianity is the precondition to the possibility of intelligible experience. So, I mean, I think that does show that of all the numerous interpretations of the Bible, when you look at all those books and all the sentences that are in them, and all the and all the things that those could mean, how are they going to get it? How do they even begin to close the deal that it's their reformed view, their own particular reformed interpretation, that is the one that you need to buy into?
Yeah. So that sort of connects to the Mormonism thing that Andrew was summarizing for the last time. Yeah,
that someone could bring up the Quran or Book of Mormon and say, we ground it here. Actually, Francis, I was saying off air to Ed about that aspect, and that when the presuppositionalist evangelical reform people have a go at looking at the Book of Mormon and thing, they say, well, we can demonstrate that they've got contradictions and errors and problems in it. And I'm thinking they're going straight into evidence about those books. You know what I mean? So, but wouldn't turn it around back on the Bible, because you've got to presuppose the Bible. And that's the Protestant one, by the way, without this extra 7 books that Catholics have. So it's touching right into just what you're saying. There's weaknesses here all over the place, I see, just on the Bible issues alone. And this, did you see the video I sent to you both about that? Obviously someone was making a sort of a case against presuppositionalism by saying something similar to what you said, Francis.
Yes, that's right. Using the example of just a power. There's just a power.
Just a power, a non-conscious power.
Yeah, and you have to assume yes, it's not God because it's not conscious.
Yes.
And if you don't assume the existence of my unconscious power, which just exists, and I'm just telling you it just exists, just know it.
Yeah.
Then you can't argue. Can't argue for your case, because you need to accept my power.
And they say, "Do you
But
believe
I
that?" He says,
told you.
"Yes, I believe it, and you know it's true as well." So, and
Yes.
he turned it around, and I thought, yes, I was trying to see
Yes.
what
Yes.
weakness there might be in that argument, but I can see what he was doing. It's brilliant. You just need a different foundation and an assumption that it's true, and you're off. They're trying to say that
Exactly.
God
Yes.
God has revealed this to us through the Bible, and he was just saying, "I've just been revealed to by this energy or this non-conscious thing." Um, um, yeah. And that's funny enough, touching into that. That's how I kind of tend to see about morality. It's like if there is objective morality as opposed to subjective morality, it I've always sort of mooted it might be sort of a non-conscious thing that just wires everybody that way. And now we know why Yahweh in the Bible is not moral. So I'm
Yeah.
just using a different foundation that would
Yes.
just tell us that we, even as Christians, look at the Bible and go, well, that's clearly not right. Oh, well, how do you know? Well, I don't know, this thing out there that's non-God or non-conscious is just universal. And funny enough, I have often thought like that, and now it tallies into this argument that guy was making. He was doing it for fun, of course, just to show
Of course.
the
Yes.
the insensibility of it.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a very clever one.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
what actually happens in a debate is that the atheist debater is trying to act in good faith and won't do that, and will instead have their more wishy-washy, qualified foundation of why they think logic and reason and rationality can be relied on.
Yeah.
Which, if we're honest, isn't incredibly well secured. And the precept man can just say, because it nearly always is a man, can say,
Yeah, true.
oh, well, I've got God for that. I'm completely fine. You're just admitting you're barely more rational than a poached egg, and just make fun and hay over the what we feel is the genuine situation, that this isn't easy to establish rationality and knowledge from nothing.
Yeah, I mean, you can't use logic to prove that logic works. You just use logic.
Yeah, so
which they have to
circular.
do. Which they have to do as much as anyone else. You know, I mean, they are basically running a logical argument, even though they say that their argument is, that logic won't work until you first presumed God. But I don't see how they're managing to avoid the fact that they're begging the question.
And what happens here is, if this is going to be a deductive argument, the idea is it ends up with the conclusion, therefore God exists. And so you can't just tease people and say, oh, you're nothing more than a poached egg. You have to have a syllogism that ends up with, therefore God exists. And what it relies on is that say logic, which is what we're mostly talking about, that logic is actually a real abstract entity that exists and isn't just a useful fiction or a heuristic device or something like that. And that has to be absolutely proved. But they're not proving it. They're just saying you can't be rational unless you assume it, which is basically an argument from kind of what you want to be, a pragmatic argument that it's true because I want it to be true and I find it useful.
An argument from consequences.
Yeah.
And also logic in Christian theology anyway. Theology is not so much being biblical, as we've discovered with the various things going on, but a systematic of logic. Hang on, my computer is switched. Did it all flash off for you then?
You were fine.
No.
All right, okay, because it took my whole screen.
Let's put a silence and then you start from
whole screen went dark then.
Okay. So let's do some silence and then we'll wait for you.
Okay. Yeah. So in theology, the logic principles, like the reason I've found that you have Calvinism and then you have the opposite sort of Arminian arguments or any of these theologies, is that certain logic is being used, because if you then argue this, then it only makes sense to go to there, and then it makes sense to go to there, and you have a set of dominoes of logic. And then, but the foundational principle of, say, Calvinism, whatever, for free will is you can have predetermined free will, compatibilism or something. I think, Francis, you is the
Yes,
term that
yes,
they
I'm a
use.
compatibilist.
That's
Yes.
right. And then there's a sort of atheistic compatibilist and a theological one. And then there's the libertarian free will, and they start with those logics, and then they sort of use the Bible to then, if that premise is true, and it's all about premises, and when it comes to logic, but both of them are using logic and coming to very, very different understandings of the real world, or in their belief, I mean. Of the belief of what's true. And so logic is definitely a tool that everybody's using, including all of us. So we're all using this tool. So the question, Ed, you're saying is that tool objectively out there for all of us to use, or is it not a thing? It's an approach or a how would you describe that in this sort of discussion?
I think it's quite a complex philosophical question of whether things like logic exist independent of human thought, and same with numbers and mathematics. And I suspect we're not going to be able to wrap that one up within the context of a discussion on something else. But I don't think it's necessary to believe in a kind of Platonic entity of logic or a Platonic entity of mathematics in order to use them and to have confidence. I think it's probably possible to say, well, I don't know whether this exists independent of human thought, or whether it is simply a function of humans having the ability to conceptualize. But in either case, what I don't believe you need to do, and what I don't see there is any advantage in doing, is positing a divine being who is the source of it. I mean, I just don't think that gets you any further at all.
Yeah. So it's begging the question.
Well, it's
might
sort
be
of
saying,
more
yeah.
like, just not really even addressing the question. It's just it's kind of a God did it. Basically, it's a God did it answer. How do we get maths? Oh, God did it. How do we
Yeah.
get morality? Oh, God did it. How do we get logic? God did it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a real answer at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not an answer that leads you to study anything, because you could argue, you could use that and just say, let's not learn anything at all, because ultimately God did it all.
Yeah.
And so in every single detail and attitude, and then, well, why do we have sciences that look at the planet? Why do we have anything?
That is why there are so many, I won't say Christian scientists, because that's got a wrong connotation to it.
Yes,
but
that's true.
Scientists who can be devout Christians who really dislike this idea of, well, God is the explanation for this. You can only explain this. How did life come about? Well, you can only explain it because God. Because they say that that closes down scientific inquiry. And they, A, as scientists, and probably B, also as Christians, feel, want to make inquiries and believe that they can understand the world, and that you don't achieve anything by batting everything back about, oh, well, it's a bit difficult. God must have done it.
Yeah, interesting. So God of the gaps in another way as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So everything's sort of God. Yeah, I mean that you see this pop up all the time, and so just whatever we discover, so we discover all kinds of stuff, and then it's like, well, you can't explain this, so God did that. We don't know where the origin of consciousness comes from. It's clearly God, until one day somebody might say, well, we've just seen this. These tests show that consciousness can be this and that, and you go, oh, okay, well, behind that is God. It keeps getting pushed back and back in these discussions, and like we said before in many other podcasts, like lightning used to be seen as something from the gods, as opposed to understandable weather patterns and things happening, and so. I mean, theistic evolutionists, if you're just going to go down that ball, that they would probably say that the evolution is no different in reality to what all biological evolutionists would say, like Richard Dawkins. But God is behind the whole lot in some way. But it's still scientifically does its stuff the way that we've discovered.
It's still a scientific question, not a theological question.
That's right. They would just say, well, there's another question for God to be behind the whole thing. but then, as Richard Dawkins probably say, well, you don't need God really. Once you've got the whole thing going, you don't need God, and it makes God a rather interesting God to be thoroughly involved in that process in some way. Whence it's argued that it works out itself once the laws are in place, in the first place. So then your argument goes back to, where do the laws come from? And that's back to this thing again: is logic an eternal reality? And even so, maybe logic was the original thing, and then you just have to accept it, that was the eternal thing. Logic, simple as that. Doesn't have to be conscious, presumably. It's just logic for some reason is there.
Yes.
I don't know why.
Yes,
you people have to say no, because a conscious being has to be the reality, and you slipped in conscious being as has to be before you've even maybe discussed does it have to be, because a conscious being in our mind is often reflecting how we think about life, and we're conscious, and so we project it back, and we project back what we understand as conscious, who makes something. Okay, so there must be a conscious thing that makes something, and these are assumptions, and of course they're presuppositions now, and so but can be probably challenged, by great minds, and great minds have challenged them. And so what do I know in that sense?
Great. Let's move on now to B, which is the youth thief fro dilemma. Now, that, of course, is a dilemma that we're familiar with for God and morality. Is God good because are things good because God wills them and commands them, or is God under goodness and wills things and commands things that are good? That's the kind of basic
yes.
dilemma.
In other words, is it good for me to love my neighbor because it's the right thing to? Does God command me to love my neighbor because it's good, or is it good for me to love my neighbor because God commands it?
Yeah, great.
And then whether that raises the question to somebody who might be thinking about this thing: is God appealing to a higher law himself? Because that would make you think that way, wouldn't it? It was like, well, God has to be good because there's this sort of thing out there that says this is what's right and this is what's wrong, as opposed to God saying, I'll decide what's right and wrong, thank you very much. But
yes,
obviously there's different people will challenge that head on, and I know what they will say, but anyway, we'll get there.
Okay.
Yes, I mean this can be applied to a similar dilemma arises with the logical principles. Don't know if you want to take that, Ed, because you've
okay,
done an analysis of it that's pretty good. Pretty good. It's very good. It's not just pretty good. It's very good.
Are logical principles valid because God wills them, or does God will them because they are valid? And it has to be the first. It has to be logical principles are valid because wills them, if we are going to do this tag, because we're saying that logical principles only have meaning because of God has willed them, and them existing outside of God is something the atheist has got has got access to without God.
Yes, that's right. That it needs, if tag is going to work, then it has to be based on God willing those logical principles.
Yeah.
Although the standard move, I think, is as the standard move on morality, which is to say, it's not arbitrary. It's grounded in the nature of character of God, and it's so God doesn't just will it arbitrarily. It's a reflection of his necessary character. So that's how they try to get round that one.
Yes, yeah. And what they're trying to get round is the way that logic it then becomes contingent. If it's something God willed, he could easily have not willed it.
That's right. Yes.
Carry on. So he could have made a world where A and not A can both apply at the same time and in the same manner, which is a sort of stating the negative of the stating of a simple logical principle, which just seems bizarre and weird. So it seems
that's sort of sorry, that would be on a sort of by analogy divine command theory. So divine command theory is really it's hard. You hardly ever find anybody who will promote divine command theory these days. And divine command theory is just that whatever God says is good is good. So God could say murder is good, and it would be good. But that's, for obvious reasons, not a very popular line to take.
No, it's
these
not.
days.
I have heard people defend the Old Testament in that way, though.
Oh, really?
So yeah. So
Interesting.
because they run across the dilemma that all those sort of what we would say as atrocities must have been wrong, and therefore God is wrong to have done them or commanded them. And they say, well, God at that point deemed that it wasn't wrong. Has the right to do that. Whereas now he's deemed that it's wrong because they are, they would be morally wrong now. And that's moral relativism within certain Christian thinking.
Yes. From people who are so scornful of anyone who they think is a moral relativist.
Exactly.
Which I'm
exactly.
not. But a lot of people assume that because I'm an atheist, I'm a moral subjectivist and or a moral relativist. And I'm not.
So your morality might be more objective than those Christians' morality.
Well, I think it is. I think it absolutely is.
And so it's like, but I have heard, seriously, in the last couple of years, you can get people who say, same with slavery. Joshua Bowden on YouTube, when he's done a lot about slavery, very interesting guy.
Oh, yes.
And he said that some of the feedback that he's got in recent years on slavery, it's not like, oh my gosh, yes, it's clearly wrong. And so it's difficult to understand. They go, oh, in that case, then slavery must have been okay. and so in other words, do anything to defend God in that view. And it's like, and he says he is so shocked that people haven't sort of just been put into a dilemma or whatever in the way, oh, maybe they thought that but God didn't, all the other sort of alternatives, but they go, okay, must have been okay. And then it's not now. So and then without seeing that other Christians will trounce them for being moral relatives. So
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the, when you try to ground it in God's nature, then I think you come up against this difficulty that theists will mock. And I think, they're probably right to be a bit scornful of this argument. The argument is about, can God make a rock so heavy that God himself couldn't lift it? And then it's sort of like whichever answer you give, you're saying God's not omnipotent. And the standard comeback to that is God is omnipotent, but omnipotence doesn't entail that you can do something that's logically impossible. But if God can't do the logically impossible, that does indicate that God is subject to the laws of logic which exist outside him and govern his own ability to do things. And he and if you say, oh well, it's in his nature, you sort of say, well, is his nature changeable? If he could change his nature, then what he has decreed for the laws of logic is also changeable and arbitrary. And if he can't change his nature, then it's still something that's imposed on him rather than necessarily being something that he particularly grounds.
Yeah, that goes, I suppose that goes into the omnis, doesn't it? And all of that sort of talk and
yes,
more Greek philosophical views of God rather than biblical or often Old Testament representations, which is like, this changing God, angry God, not even knowing that he might not
remorseful God, regretful God with his buyer's remorse.
Angry too quickly at times, even though there's other verses that says slow to anger. So all of these representations don't fit well with this sort of more almost static version of God. But then the logic, I see what you mean. Like, because they will say God doesn't rely on anything outside of him because they see the problem there, because God would just be a bigger version than us. You know what I mean? That he's subject to you've got no foundation. Well, you could say, well, Yahweh has no foundation unless there's this thing out there, but they put it all back into him. So he is, but even the Bible talks about God as cannot do certain things, like he cannot deny himself, he cannot lie, even though there's passages that you say probably argue he does or did. New Testament ones, I mean, and I think there's a third one.
And Old Testament.
Actually, what that he?
That he does lie. Yeah,
No,
there's
no,
more.
I meant that these are New Testament verses. One that says he cannot lie is in the New
Right.
Testament,
Yeah.
and also cannot deny himself is in the New
Well, it's
Testament.
a lie, isn't it? Clearly.
Yeah, clearly it's a lie. If it's a cannot lie. And so you've got these Old Testament sort of deceptive passages, which you have to say, well, it looks like if you step back from any kind of theology trying to impose a change to the text, it looks like he was deceptive here and over here. And so, but to put all of this within God as a way out, I think Reasonable Doubts podcast did a challenge to that. They were challenging this idea of suddenly dealing with the problem by putting it all into God. This whole thing. So logic. So in other words, it's like saying God is morality, God is logic, God is everything, and so therefore he is a being which just operates subject to himself because he just is, and that's where you have to sit down and shut up. So
Yeah.
there's nothing further you can do. But then
And
he's
that doesn't really help very much, does it? I mean, it's the same as us saying, well, logic's just a thing. It just is.
Yeah,
it's
it
part
just
of the
is.
universe.
He's just saying it's part of him and omnipresent, so he's everywhere. Omnipotent, he can do everything, and you just said he can't do some things. So omniscience, again, the open theists would have a field day and say, yeah, God can't know everything because the Bible doesn't present him that way. But he can only know what's logically possible to know. That's an open theist argument, actually. And God can only be where he logically possibly can be, and so there's always qualifications to the omnis in theology that I can see. But anyway, it's this thing about inherently trying to get away from the argument by saying God isn't subject to a foundation outside himself. He is the foundation for all of these things, whereas we are subject to him as a foundation. That's the case, isn't it, that they're trying to make?
Yeah. But they found it very difficult because of this dilemma to say exactly how it all works, and they just have to sort of say, oh, it's all in the nature of God, which to me is just kicking the can down the road, really.
Yeah. I don't know. It needs unpacking a bit more, but I'm not so good at really unpacking that particular one of saying pushing it all back into God. So so therefore, but it still means that God is subject to himself, if you see what I mean, in the sense that if all morality is objective, so it's always wrong to do this. So God can't say it's so that's what Francis' point, isn't it? God can't say, oh, for this time this is okay, and for this time it isn't, because he's subject to himself.
Yeah. And you get a sort of dilemma where if God just happens to be good and happens to be logical and be and not have worlds where A and not A can both apply at the same time, then you're saying that God might not have been like that. In which case,
luck of the draw.
Yes, in which case it's as random as God happening to say logic works this way and not that way.
Yeah.
So the randomness hasn't been dealt with.
Yeah.
And if you deal with the randomness saying, well, God has to be perfect, or it's necessary, God is necessarily how God is, then it seems like you're playing something outside of God that imposes his nature.
Yeah. That's a good point, actually, about God, the randomness of why God is God, if you see what I mean. It's like as a child, I used to think that. I thought, you're lucky, aren't you? Why did you get to be God? You know what I mean? and then I would put it the other way and go, well, at least I'm not a pig, I suppose. But no disrespect to pigs, but you know what I mean? But it's like the randomness of life is just that
should have been my job.
I'm sure a pig, if they could, that's right. If a pig could formulate thoughts, it would go, why couldn't I be one of them humans instead of just in here eating all this muck? And so, but I used to think that. I used to think you were lucky, and I used to think the Apostle Paul was lucky to be getting that vision, in the way that most people don't. And why was he? Why did he get to get? Why can't we all have an Apostle Paul experience? That would be good. And so those are childhood questions. They're often the most powerful.
Yeah.
I find, simplistic ones.
Okay, so I want to carry on, keep things moving. So another objection is the cultural and historical variability of all of this. And particularly the kind of what even logic is, and how it's viewed in different cultures and with different theologies.
Yeah.
So we've covered that to a degree with kind of Mormonism as a sort of option. But actually, I find it quite odd that logic and syllogisms and everything, they've seemed to come from the Greek polytheistic culture and not from the monotheistic Hebrew culture. So
yes,
it seems odd that this unique God should have kind of fed logic into a society, and that society has then explained it to the rest of the world. When that society wasn't his society at all, but a completely separate polytheistic one with very non-ethereal and distant gods, and not omni gods, but Zeus-like ones. I was struck.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about Greek history to comment, but I think some people would say that people like Plato weren't polytheists.
No.
They would have believed in one supreme being. But I sort of say that I wear that view quite lightly because I don't know enough about it to comment. But I think that might be there.
Yeah,
I think
but they certainly didn't. They didn't believe in the Hebrew God, did they?
No,
no.
That's certainly true.
But the Hebrew God eventually became, oddly enough, very much tallied with the Greek views of this sort of Platonic God of omniscient, ever-presence, the ground of all being, and all that business. Which leads me to think that because Plato is, when I was doing my Atlantis sort of studies on this, I thought here was an issue. It was like, okay, so in Plato he's talking about Poseidon coming down and having offspring with the women, and then having 12 kingdoms across Atlantis and this everything else. And I'm thinking, but that's not the Greek god at all. These are more tribal kind of gods, in a sense, at war with each other and being able to have offspring from humans, and so I thought that they must be by then of just using them as, like, I don't know, maybe tropes of the ancient way of talking about gods, which of course we don't hold, but you can use them in story form to make points. That's the only thing I could really come up with, rather than saying Poseidon was real in Plato's mind. And so, and all the other ones, by the way. So it's an interesting one. I need to do some more research myself.
Yeah. I got this partly from Julian Baggini, who we've mentioned previously. He wrote a book, How the World Thinks, and he does a whole tour of philosophy in all cultures around the globe. And it was quite striking how it is a Western view of the world, the one that's logical, uses syllogisms, and talks about logic in the way that we have been over the last three-quarters of an hour or so.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he's very good. I pronounce his name Baggini, but I'm not sure which of us is right. You may well be right, and I may be wrong. But anyway, we're talking about the same person, and yeah, he's very good.
Yeah.
I think it's very good.
Yeah. So that makes it odd to think that God is the Hebrew God is the complete source of logic, and the whole world understands logic because of that God made the whole world and has given us that knowledge, and all the rest of it. It just seems a bit far-fetched.
Well, particularly when you just read the natural. I mean, these presuppositionalists want you to read the Bible plainly and naturally when it comes to the creation story, 6 days. But when it comes to, God, I think I might not come with you because I'll get too angry and smite you, so I'll stay home, basically, in some passages. Or Moses has to sort of talk him out, basically, of killing everybody because of his promise and telling it. That doesn't sound like this God that they're talking about, even in the Bible, that they're saying that you need to have the foundation of. So I find it very confusing.
Yeah.
It's almost as if the Bible to them is some abstract, solid unit of something that we can't really know about. It's just there. And then when you look at it, it's very different when you read it. It doesn't read as they would want you to read it, ideally, I think, in terms of, it needs to be talking about presuppositionalism, ideally, but it doesn't, not clearly.
Okay, so the next one is something that Josh has put us on to, but it's something I've been batting on about for years. And that is how God is a terrible foundation for secure knowledge. And I'll try to talk us through it. Josh actually suggested a paper by someone called Dan Linford, and that link to that will be in the show notes. He's put it in the Dropbox, so I'm hoping that listeners from anywhere can access this. It certainly worked for me. Okay, so what this paper is doing is sort of joining the dots fairly effectively and rigorously on some things which we're all fairly familiar with. Firstly, the presupposition claims that knowledge comes only via revelation in the Bible. That's what we've been talking about these 2 episodes. So that's point 1. Now let's start again somewhere else, and that's the problem of evil. And the response to the problem of evil called skeptical theism. We did a whole episode on this from the early days, about episode 3 or so, and I think it's fairly familiar. It's the idea that it's sort of beyond our ken to understand what God's purpose is in the evils we see in the world, and not just that we don't know what bigger plan God has. Even if God explained the plan to us, we might still not understand it. So it's just completely above our pay grade to understand evils in the world. And that is how skeptical theists deal with the problem of evil. Now, if you're a precept person, you're relying solely on the Bible for your understandings, because you have to. And the Bible teaches skeptical theism. So you have to accept it. The paper picks up especially on the book of Job, where in the climax of Job, God appears and says, sort of, where were you when I made the foundations of the earth and I scattered the planets or the stars across the sky and all those things. It's a couple of chapters of this poetry. And the message is loud and clear that Job cannot understand God's, he's inscrutable, he's incomprehensible, he's above us, and God doesn't need to explain. And there are other passages in the Bible like that, which we can list that come from this paper. That there's a lovely bit of poetry in actually Romans that it appears that Paul is quoted about how inscrutable God is, and there's the famous "My ways are not your ways" in Isaiah, and so it goes on. So this is a Bible teaching.
Yeah. But do you remember back in the podcast, way back in the early days? By the way, this episode is our 5th year anniversary.
Oh,
when we started,
goodness.
Yeah, it was February the 4th, I believe, not 2018. But way back in those early days, I think, Ed, you were pretty flummoxed by the idea of that one particular verse you mentioned about the Lord's ways, which Roger Forster, he just passed away, by the way, and he was the one that put me onto that my thoughts are not your thoughts and neither are your ways my ways. And this is so crucial because for years I just assumed it meant what people told me it meant. And it's this sort of inscrutable, which is why this guy would have used it, no doubt. Yeah. And actually the context, and I remember you were quite shocked by this, but the context is actually the people are not, they're living their ways and having their thoughts, and God wants them to live his thoughts and his ways. And so in that passage, just before that verse, it goes, seek the Lord while he may be found. This is what I did in that podcast way back, probably 5 years ago now. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them turn to the Lord and he will have mercy of them. And then it goes on, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways. The passage is about morals, about not living your ways, but living my ways. These are revealed things, not mysterious things. They are my thoughts and my ways on how to live, i.e. the law. Do you know what I mean? And so it's got nothing in this context. I was convinced through Roger's teaching on this way back, probably 20 years ago now. And I went back and really studied the passage just to say, surely not. But why do people lift this verse out and make it to the inscrutable ways of God when actually this one is about, you need to follow my laws, basically. You're not doing it. and my ways are better. They are the ones I want for you. Do you see what I mean? And so I'm
Yes,
just wondering whether some of the other passages that
Yes,
we've
I
made
do.
inscrutable.
I remember that.
I
Yeah,
do remember. I do remember
yeah,
that we took that passage and looked at what else it might mean. But I think,
yeah.
still we have the
We have the other
situation.
ones, like the secret
We
We
things
have
have
the
the
other
other
belong to the
ones,
Lord.
passages,
Yeah,
and
and
anyway,
and
it's skeptical theists who are kind of pushing this narrative. And if God
yes.
can allow evil to achieve a greater good, then lying is an evil. So why shouldn't God use
well,
that
yeah, I'm
to
coming on
achieve
to
a
that.
greater good?
Which we
Yeah.
have. Yeah.
Yeah. So can I go back to finish the thing? So there's two reasons why presupps are committed to skeptical theism.
Yeah.
One is that they're plain reading of the Bible, which is the point I was going to make on this Isaiah thing. If you have to be clever and interpret it and think about it in a rational way, then you're not just taking it at face value. So if people taking it at face value have made that mistake, then that's what God intended in the presupp view of things. Quite apart from, there's plenty of other passages that make this inscrutable claim anyway. So the Bible teaching it is one, and the second one is the Dan Linford in the paper gives lots of quotes from Banson explaining that presupps have to be committed to this anyway. Just how they cope with the problem of evil, their presuppositions and everything lead him down this route that we just don't understand God. And there's lots of nice quotes from Banson and people in the paper just to sort of nail that point. So the next point is what Francis was launching us into. So do you want to go back and carry on with where you were at, Francis?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I thought we'd sort of naturally got to that point, but yes, the point is that if skeptical theists say that we have to accept that God can allow evil, in fact, in circumstances perhaps even create evil, because it serves a greater good, then one of the evils in the world is lying and deception. And why can't God allow those? If we can't understand God, and if we can't see his overarching plan, then why couldn't his overarching plan include deception in order to achieve greater good?
Yeah.
And if we're appalled at the thought of God lying to us, then we say, well, we're also appalled at the thought of God drowning all those babies in the flood.
Yes.
But clearly that was justified and there was no problem with it at all, and it was all part of some massive, wonderful, greater good plan. So there's
Why
no
not
reason
lying?
to think that the lying can't equally be in part of some great plan.
I can remember, funny enough, because Josh is a listener of ours and probably will be listening. I can remember actually Josh speaking on this issue, but I can't remember where it was. I think it might have been one of our groups up in the city.
Yeah, it was.
And
He did, because he did a paper, didn't he, on the problem of evil and whether it was evidence against the existence of God.
Yeah, that's right. And I can remember him saying something like, leading back philosophically to that God couldn't lie or doesn't lie. And I pointed out, but you've got a Bible right in front of you with I think it was the one where God said, who will go and deceive the prophet for me? And the Spirit says, yes, I will. And I completely said, we've got a Bible in front of you that says this, and you're saying that. And I remember Josh's reaction sort of was to laugh in a sense of like, okay, how am I going to answer this? In a good way. It was like, okay, that's a good one. Basically, that was the emphasis I got from it. And then he said, well, you might be able to make an argument that it wasn't actually God, it was the Spirit as in that said, I'll do it. But of course, realizing that, of course, that Spirit is just offering to do what God wanted. And so to shift the blame, that's like, I don't know, somebody at war, the head, the leader of the war, it is also partly responsible for what the army does. It's not just the soldiers on their own. Do you know what I mean? So, but anyway, I brought that up because it's like, here we go. We got the Bible that flat flies in the face of the proposition that's being stated. So I wonder if Josh can remember that. Josh, do you remember it? That moment. But anyway, yeah. So back to the point. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've now established that God could be lying in Scripture, in Revelation.
Yep.
And so we have absolutely no reason to rely on it for the foundation of our knowledge. So the basic precept claim that God underpins and is the foundation of knowledge and no one else possibly can be, that has collapsed.
So we're nearing the end of our time here. So is there anything that you both want to sort of like just refresh, recap, make some points that you may have missed out or whatever, and before we sort of finish for this time?
I'm happy.
Not from me. Not from me. I'm happy. And Ed, I know you're going to put some things in the show notes so people will be able to do further research.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was that, and so we look forward to the next subject that we'll do, undecided as yet, in detail. So we'll get back to you, and you'll know what that is as soon as we crash in next month. So for this time, I've been Andrew, your host,
And I've been Frances.
And I've been Ed, and thank you for listening to us on Precepts.